What can Tucker Carlson learn from Kurt Gödel? I want to talk about the recent interview that Carlson had about science. I'm going to put the interview in the show notes. And generally, sort of the idea of conservatism and spiritual or Christianity or any kind of spiritual, actually, it's not just based on Christianity, but this idea that science is not the whole answer. And then we fall back to spiritual explanation of the world. And I want to push back here. And what happens in the interview is that actually Tucker, and credit to him, he's definitely somebody who goes out there and really does, I think, phenomenal journalism. You know, he interviews world leaders, and I'm not just referring to the Putin interview, but generally world leaders out there. He talks to Silicon Valley people about AI. He talks to scientists about science. So he's not just giving speeches about Jesus. He's trying to understand, in particular, he wants to understand, okay, what is it that science can give us? Where are the limits of science, and how can we reconcile this with spirituality? So this is roughly what this particular episode is about. And the reason I want to talk about this is because it's very close to my heart. Epistemology is what we do as a hedge fund. The purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. Orange Capital Partners, which is the fund that I run together with my partner and that I've been doing for 16 years now, is a hedge fund. We are in the knowledge business, so epistemology is very natural to us. So we like to think about what is knowledge, how is knowledge created, how can we use the knowledge to actually get us a certain result that we're looking for, whether it's to make money in the market, whether it's to increase our health or happiness or help somebody that we love. Knowledge should be useful. And in this particular interview that I'm referring to, I think Tucker Carlson is rightly so lining out the differences or the limits of science. What I don't like about him is that he kind of implicitly falls back to spirituality. He says, okay, if science doesn't work, the Bible's right. Same with people like Jordan Peterson. What I don't like about this approach is that I think I'm a Popperian in that sense, that I think we should do better. Instead of just falling back, if we find the limits of something, then let's try to improve it. Let's not just fall back on something that we had even before. What that means in concrete terms is that if I'm questioning Darwinism and the theory of evolution, like Tucker Carlson does, and I am falling back to creationism, and I'm using Kurt Gödel actually as almost as a proof, or at least as a support of my thesis, because what Kurt Gödel did, together with Bertrand Russell, with David Hilbert, and a plethora of other people, including the quantum physicists, starting from Heisenberg all the way to Feynman and David Deutsch today, they are showing us the limits of knowledge. And they are showing us some, in principle, fundamental limits of how we can use current tools of mathematics and logic to explain the world. They are showing us those limits. But I think instead of falling back to spirituality and say, well, then, okay, let's just throw everything out and let's go back to what we had before, I think I'm Popperian in that way, and I'm calling out these people to try to do better, to try to find better solutions to certain problems, whether it's the incompleteness theorem by Kurt Gödel, whether it's the inconsistencies of Bertrand Russell, whether it's the inability to clearly define space and momentum within quantum mechanics, whether it's our inability to understand what is real and what isn't. I think all of these questions, they ask for better solutions. We don't understand consciousness. We don't quite understand how we learn. We don't understand what learning means. I am working right now on a small paper, maybe an essay, or maybe just a podcast episode about physics, the physics of machine learning, and where I'm actually questioning certain assumptions, and I'm trying to find solutions to certain problems. For example, over parameterization. Why is it that we can have many more parameters than samples in a deep learning model and still get good general results out of it? What's going on here? So I am working on this because I don't have the illusion that I'm going to find some breakthrough knowledge here, but I want to start scratching the surface of what's known and where are the problems. The same way that Max Planck was scratching the surface of the understanding of thermodynamics when he did black body radiation work, and then he discovered quantized energy states, and then the birth of quantum mechanics came from there. That's just to say that we can always do better, and we should not fall back to something that came before just because the current state of knowledge has limits. This is a Not Even Wrong podcast. It's August 6, 2024. This is Krim Delko. This is the second installment today. For the year, we are down 3.2%. The market is up 10.6%. We're underperforming by 13.8%. So what's the relationship with David Hilbert, Bertrand Russell, Kurt Gödel, Tucker Carlson, and let's say quantum mechanics in general? What is the relationship here? Why am I putting all these names in one bucket? I want to talk about Tucker Carlson as a symbol for a conservative worldview that falls back to creationism and spirituality and questions modern science. And I want to do this as somebody, by the way, just as a tangent here, who has been completely disillusioned by the science community during COVID. I believe what happened around people like Anthony Fauci and the general so-called elite scientific community has been nothing short but disastrous for truth, for liberty, for the future of our kids. Horrible what happened there. The suppression of knowledge, the imposition of science as a truth instead of science as a method. So all of that aside, I am still incredibly in favor of science as a method. I think science is a method. It's not something one uses as justification, or it's not even something you believe in. It's just a method, and you either believe in the method, not in the science itself. The results of the science are always going to be falsified, most likely. It's possible that we will find some sort of absolute truth, but as we've seen with Kurt Gödel, there is no such thing. And as David Deutsch said beautifully in one of his talks, actually what Kurt Gödel did is open the doors to creativity by showing us that within the system, we can never define everything, we can never prove everything, not everything is knowable within the system that we live in. We need something from the outside, and that brings in, just to throw in another name, Hugh Everett's multiverse theory of quantum mechanics or multiverse interpretation. But let's not go there now. Let's keep it simple. So what Kurt Gödel did in his incompleteness theorem, he showed that mathematics within itself cannot always be true and proven at the same time. Let's leave it at that. He piggybacks on what Bertrand Russell already noticed in Principia Mathematica, which is simply that a sentence like "I am always saying lies," a sentence like that makes no sense, right? And mathematics is full of these types of statements. So within that context, we have basically the limits of science have been shown to us in the 1930s, of almost 100 years ago. So we've gotten to the limits of science. By the way, the reason I mentioned David Hilbert in the prelude is because he was the mathematician who called for a comprehensive theory of mathematics as a base for knowledge. And Kurt Gödel basically said, you can't do that. Mathematics is not enough to explain everything. We have subsequently, we have Hugh Everett with the multiverse theory trying to explain the fundamental problem of quantum mechanics, which is that nothing is observable from within. You need something from the outside to observe something. And if our system as a whole is quantum, our universe, well, there has to be something else relative to this universe, so the universe can actually have some location or some momentum and things like that. In principle, and he came up with the idea of the multiverse, which is there's something outside of our universe, another universe, a multiverse, let's call it, part of the multiverse, that can be then observing us from the outside. We don't see that, but they see us, kind of thing. I am not 100% familiar with Hugh Everett's theory, but that's the way I understand. So, but again, I'm sorry for digressing. What I want to talk about here is, in particular, something that Tucker Carlson did recently in his interview, and again, it's in the show note, the interview. And the reason I paid attention to it is because he was on the right path, right? He was questioning science and the absolute validity of science, which is great. But then I think implicitly he likes to fall back to creationism, the scripture, the Bible, whatnot, things like that. And I think that's where I disagree, because I'm saying, look, Tucker, and anybody else who is on that boat, we can do better than that. I think it's our duty as adults, as the torch carriers of this in this multiverse for our next generation, to do better and not fall back. Whether we fall back on the conservative side, back to creationism, or whether we fall back on the left with socialism, that's not good enough. We need to do better. We can do better. And I am incredibly in favor of showing the limits of science, but I absolutely disagree that we should throw the science away. We should embrace it and do even better. This is the whole premise of this episode. I just want to point it out. We're in an election year. I think we've discussed politics in this podcast sometimes, not too often. This is not a political podcast by any means, but of course we can't escape it. We've said a few political things, such as, for example, that wealth creation and liberty are two sides of the same coin. We are in favor of liberty because it is good for the future of our species. We believe liberty is the absence of coercion, and it's the replacement of ideas with better ideas. That's what liberty really means. Whether it's replacing a US president with another president without violence, whether it's replacing a theory in physics with a new theory without violence, whether that violence is physical or, like mostly in physics, it's non-physical, but still there's violence in terms of suppression and coercion and all that stuff. So Hugh Everett is a good example of that. So we believe that is absolutely necessary for a creative flow of ideas. And that creative flow of ideas creates new technologies. The purpose of our hedge fund is to invest in fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices. We only get them from the creative flow of ideas. And that's where wealth is created. This is something that the late Clayton Christensen said beautifully. Growth can only happen through disruption. Disruption is another word for fundamentally new engineering practices and concepts. And they happen because they enable something to be done at much better value and lower cost. So to summarize, this episode is it's really a call out to all the scientists and all the critics, such as Tucker Carlson out there, to take science seriously, to acknowledge that it's a method and nothing more than that, and that epistemology, which is the science of science itself, can also be looked at as just a method. And the method, the fundamental underlying driving force of the method is improvement. So if we have a limit in logic, such as what Gödel showed us, or we have limits in understanding reality, like quantum mechanics is showing us, How do we reconcile the fact that a photon can be at two places at the same time? It can be a wave and a particle at the same time. How do we reconcile that? We look for better theories, better explanations. This is David Deutsch. And the better explanations, they are the kinds of explanations that tend to proliferate throughout the multiverse. And they tend to stick because they're hard to vary, and they help almost as a side. It's not a prerequisite, but they do help us in solving problems. That's why they are sticky. That's why they are proliferating throughout the multiverse, because they help solve problems. And solving problems is finding solutions, obviously, to questions that we have, and that's a really beautiful thing about us humans, that we can actually ask questions and find those problems through the creative flow of ideas. So my call out to people like Tucker Carlson is, look, I appreciate your work. I think you're a phenomenal journalist, but don't fall back to creationism. Don't let the scripture be the end of your quest. Use it as a base. Nothing wrong with that. But try to do better. Try to find better explanations for questions. Thank you.